All right, after this, I'm probably going to take a couple days off because my brain needs a rest after the last couple of days. Now we know for sure that there was storage in the bow of the boat. All right, so now at this point, I am pretty sure that the Triton was there all day. They didn't switch out the boats. And I'm also pretty certain at this point that this is a real video because there's one single frame where you can see Bart's boat and you can also see the toes of somebody like dangling them off the water. So if the picture or video were AI, it would be a really bizarre thing for it to just kind of throw in. But there's zero question in my mind that this video has been altered. So then the question becomes, why would they alter this video? And the only thing that logically makes sense to me is to alter the identity of the two girls. Because if Carter is the boy in red, Wyatt is the boy in the American shorts, Bart's brother Brooke being the one in the navy blue shorts, and then Ike being the one in the teal shorts. Then we've got Warren up here with somebody in this red striped swimsuit and the girl in the teal swimsuit with the backwards hat. So in this picture, this would be Brooks, this would be Ike, this would be Wyatt, this would be Warren, which would leave this to be Carter. Now, whoever this is seems to be very cuddly with Carter. Like, too cuddly, in my opinion, for it to be like a mother or a family member. Thinking about it a lot from the timeline that we have been told. And what we haven't really been factoring in again is the party. Because remember, Warren said he went to the party, but instead of talking with all of his friends, he went upstairs to go talk with his girlfriend's dad. Now, those families are tight. So if that dad of Ava, if that conversation with the dad didn't happen, then they would automatically know that they were lying. So I've been saying for a while that the girl was somehow involved. And mind you, everybody's back on land now. They're getting ready to do the fireworks and everybody's swimming and drinking still, blah, blah, blah. So what's the excuse for no pictures at that party? They've explained it all away during the day, but at this point, they're all just being teenagers and having fun again, right? So I'm thinking that the brunette girl is Ava, the girl whose house they went to. And she's pretty close with Warren and the Pyrone family.
And they're full speed running. And then after that, I didn't see them anymore. I think you were on the boat. You start from there?
Yeah, so after we planed off, Wyatt kept the boat pinned the whole way in. We ran into the mouth of Fort Bayou, where we came from originally. And we turned into Fort Bayou, went in the channel, ran probably 500, 600 yards into Fort Bayou. Wyatt had jumped out of the boat, put the plug back in the boat so access water. So water didn't keep pushing and filling back the boat.
According to their own words, they went into the mouth and then they turned and they went about 500-600 feet. Now, mind you, the party house is right around, but they go past it and then loop back around. However, Warren just admitted that at some point they had to stop and Wyatt jumped in. And even then, you heard him stuttering over the story. Like, it wasn't a smooth transition. Because I think they dropped her off. Which would explain why they would go back to this party, because obviously they can't cancel the party. That looks really suspicious. Then, my theory has always been that the guys all, like, broke off and, like, talked to the parents about what was going on. And that's when they formulated their whole, we'll call her and then we'll call the Coast Guard plan. Remember, she is related. Somehow I can't figure out, but she is related through marriage to the lieutenant that wrote up the very initial report we've seen. Because remember how Morgan claimed that the picture of the boat stuff was circulating around Snapchat and stuff, even though Christine didn't post it to her Facebook page until the next day. Listen to this.
His mom was, what was he wearing? And so we were trying to remember what color his shorts were. We couldn't quite figure that out.
I said black.
Yeah, I think we said black.
I really did. He was wearing navy blue shorts?
Yeah, it was like dark blue shorts.
Dark. I just said black because I was trying to piece everything together and help out.
And so at this point, we're freaking out. We don't know where our friend's at. And the girl that took the picture, she was like, okay, well, I just took this picture of today. This is what color swim trunks he was wearing. And his mom asked for that to post on Facebook to say, if you've seen him, whatever, this is what he was wearing.
So remember, the girl who took the picture with the digital camera was on Wyatt's boat at the beginning of the day and then was there with them at night when they were having this discussion. So she had to have been there at the beginning and at the party at the very least. Then we remembered that the original shorts picture, well, that wasn't the color of his shorts, as we now know. So we also know for a fact that this picture did not get sent to Christine until July 5th, meaning that they had to have had that picture and then not sent it to her for hours. Because they also said this.
And so that's what we sent to her, or that's what she sent to her, because we're just trying.
So they corrected themselves. He said, we sent it. No, she sent it. So on July 5th, Christine said that they have been up for almost 48 hours straight, and then the very next post above it are the same pictures but better quality. Why did it take so long to get these pictures to them? Oh, and y'all, now that I said that, I realize, so all of these pictures had to come from the same digital camera, right? Meaning this picture did as well. And since I've already proven that this picture had used AI to do something weird because, you know, there was no little bar here, only explanation for using AI on just this little part would be to obscure the reflection that was in this poll of the person who was taking the video. Or the pictures. Oh my God, yes. That makes sense. Love it when I figure that stuff out in real time for you on camera. So it makes sense to me that this photo video thing was altered to cover up this girl's swimsuit. Because let's face it, this swimsuit is the ugliest thing. It has like supposedly like sleeves and it's a tankini, but it goes like in a weird cut, but it's ugly. It's ugly and it's clearly not what these debutante beauty queen girls are wearing to a 4th of July beach party. So I'm like 70% sure that this is Ava. Oh wait, oh my God. Wait a second. Shown y'all guys before that there's 4 boats out here in this little cluster, right? But I'm looking at these weird pink lumps and stuff at the front of the boat, Bart's boat here. Is that a pile of life vests? Because I'm realizing there's not 20, 30 people on all of these boats. Like I'm seeing 10, 12 people here tops. Let's not forget what a full house looks like on these boats. Because even in this video at the meetup place, there's not 20, 30 people getting ready to get on these boats. I mean, the boat left at 9:56, according to the GPS. We got like 7, 8 people here, like 6 people here. And also, if they were legitimately needing to be towed and they were trying to get the water to run off, why are they all spread out on the boat? Why are they on the boat in general? Why didn't they just get off on land or get on another boat? Trying to get the boat to tip up and go planing, why do you have over half the boat on the front of the boat? These are experienced fucking fishermen. They know better than that. Yeah, I can't believe I've never thought of that before. If the boat was sinking, why are they even on the fucking boat? Yeah, and if it was so common and so easy to get, you know, rides back with other people, you know, strangers on Horn Island, why did they need to load everybody on the boat? Or were they yelling at Nolan to get on the boat? They didn't need to get him on the boat. And now that I'm looking at this, doesn't it look like Warren is on the phone? Could this have been when he was calling his mom 8 times? Also, one more thing that stuck out to me.
We called law enforcement. I was with Wyatt at the time after we left Jackson's house that night. I was with Wyatt and one person we were with saw that their location was headed towards Wyatt's house. And so Wyatt got on the phone with 911 and was like, hey, these people are on the way to my house or already at my house. My mom and my dad are there alone and they know nothing about this.
He stumbled over his words from beginning to end in that story, so I don't believe any of it. But the one thing that sticks out to me was the phrasing, they don't know anything about this. If people are heading over to your house, why wouldn't you call your mom and dad before you called 911? Because it sounded like he was trying to keep his parents out of the loop of this story, which as a teenage boy implies that you have something to hide. Just a lot of different things to think about, right?
Here's something interesting that I didn't realize, did you? That first of all, the judge was on the island, according to Warren.
You could.
If you want to sit there, if you're motivated enough to do it, yeah. Like, I made a phone call to my mom, and I had to call her like 8 times before she picked up because either her service was bad, she was on the back side of the aisle on the south side, or my service was bad, and it was just hard to get through.
She was on the island. That's very interesting. And here's another thing. This allegedly, on the ledge of allegedly, 911 call where they talk about going to the judge's house. Why would 911 get called to the judge's house? I don't know. What do you guys think?
We're en route to the judge's house. Wow. Negative. We're en route to the judge's house. Wow. You said y'all are en route to the judge's house or from the judge's house? En route to the judge's house.
Hey, I'm just here asking the questions, not accusing, not saying anything at all, but it is a little bit odd, especially after the judge texted Christine just saying, if and when you ever want to talk, here's my number. Why would she say if or when? Why would she say if? It's weird.
We have a new update regarding Nolan Wells, and I'm going to say it. It is a bombshell piece of information regarding the Nolan Wells investigation. Over the last couple of days, you've heard me say that the family is waiting for the district attorney to get in touch with them to schedule that joint investigation and cell phone extraction. We just found out on August 13th, which was literally just 2 days ago, that said District Attorney McElrath of the Jackson County, Mississippi, decided to send another letter to the family stating, you have 48 hours to drop off the cell phone. I'm sorry, is that the same thing as a joint investigation?
Somewhere on Horn Island, during the last hour that anyone can account for, Nolan Wells was still alive. And somewhere between that final known hour and the phone call that told his mother he was not coming home, something happened that has never been fully explained by the people who were on that boat. 6 weeks later, the case is now facing a grand jury. Investigators still do not have Nolan's phone in their possession. And his mother, instead of simply receiving answers about what happened to her son, has reportedly found herself under scrutiny for asking questions and pushing for information about his final night. But if that phone is important enough to become part of the public discussion, then every question surrounding it deserves to be examined. What about the audio recording that has already been raised in connection with this case? What about the fact that Nolan's phone and keys were reportedly already with someone else before the situation was formally treated as a missing person investigation? And what about the dock footage? Investigators released footage showing the boat leaving that morning. So the obvious question becomes, where is the footage showing the boat coming back? If that camera stopped recording during the period that matters most, that does not automatically prove anything. But it is still a detail that deserves a clear explanation. And according to the description already given publicly, the lawyer who currently has control of Nolan's phone continues to hold on to it. That raises another question. What exactly is being waited for? Time matters in any investigation. Physical evidence can change, digital information can become harder to reconstruct, and memories can become less precise. So if investigators believe the phone could help clarify the timeline, why has it taken this long for the device to become part of the official process? And before anyone places that responsibility on a grieving mother, there is an even bigger question that needs to be addressed. Why wasn't law enforcement requesting the phone themselves during the earliest days of the investigation? 6 weeks ago, before the medical examiner had completed the autopsy, someone had already characterized what happened to Nolan as a drowning. But the medical examiner's work exists for a reason. Determining the circumstances and manner of death is supposed to be based on the evidence and the completed examination, not on assumptions made before the scientific process is finished. If this case had been handled as a full investigation from the very beginning, the phone, the keys, the boat, the recordings, and every other potentially relevant piece of evidence could have been secured and examined immediately. Instead, weeks later, some of those same questions are still being debated publicly, raising concerns about the decisions made during those first critical hours and days. Who determined what should be treated as evidence, and why are some of those questions still unresolved now? There is also another issue that deserves attention. Why is the district attorney's office reportedly stepping back from what was originally expected to be a joint investigation? That question becomes even more significant as new information continues to circulate online. This week, a TikTok creator who has been closely examining the case frame by frame says she noticed something in the available boat footage that could change the understanding of who was actually present that day. Now, that claim needs to be handled carefully. There is a major difference between something a creator believes they have identified in a video and something investigators can independently confirm. A theory can raise an important question, but it does not automatically become evidence simply because it appears convincing on social media. That is exactly why we are going to look at what she is claiming and compare it with what has actually been said publicly and what can be established from the available information. Tonight, we're examining both sides, looking at the claims while separating them from confirmed facts. When a case is this serious, the goal should not be to turn every unanswered question into an accusation, but to understand what is known, what remains uncertain, and what investigators still need to establish. And there is another detail buried within a Nancy Grace panel that deserves much more attention. A digital forensics expert discussed what investigators may already be able to retrieve from Nolan's phone remotely, even without physically having the device in their possession. But there is an important limit to that. Digital information can sometimes help establish pieces of a timeline, communication history, location-related data, or other activity associated with a device. But remote information is not necessarily the same thing as having the actual phone in hand. The physical device can contain information, context, or evidence that may not be available through remote records alone. Understanding that distinction is critical, because once you understand what investigators can potentially obtain without the phone, and where those capabilities stop, the delays surrounding this case may look very different. The central issue is not simply whether Nolan's phone exists or who currently has it. The real question is what information that phone could potentially provide about the final hours of Nolan Wells' timeline, and why obtaining that information has become such a complicated part of the investigation. And as new footage and online analysis continue to draw attention to the case, those questions are becoming harder to ignore.
Tonight, in the Nolan Wells investigation, tonight the timeline seemingly blows up. This as Nolan's mother is investigated. Why? And tonight, possibly even more important, where is Nolan's phone?
We have a new update regarding Nolan Wells, and I'm going to say it. It is a bombshell piece of information regarding the Nolan Wells investigation. Over the last couple of days, you've heard me say that the family is waiting for the district attorney to get in touch with them to schedule that joint investigation and cell phone extraction. We just found out on August 13th, which was literally just 2 days ago, that said district attorney Mickelrath of the Jackson County, Mississippi, decided to send another letter to the family stating, you have 48 hours to drop off the cell phone. I'm sorry, is that the same thing as a joint investigation when the words are, you have 48 hours to drop off the cell phone, or you have 48 hours to, possess the cell phone for us? Is that the same thing as saying we're going to have a joint investigation? Don't you worry, I'm going to show you the letter right now. Here is the actual letter sent from A.R. Smith, the same attorney that sent out the letter on August 11th. I want to point your attention to right here. To date, Nolan's parents remain willing to facilitate an appropriate forensic examination of Nolan Wells' phone, including FBI involvement, according to our agreement on July 15th. However, your letter sent to Eric Hertz on August 12th at 12:51 p.m. set a deadline for Wednesday to deliver the phone to your office by August 14th at 9 a.m. This is not practical for a number of reasons. Now, that's a 2-page letter. I just showed you one of the excerpts. But the reason why it's not practical is 2 big reasons. And again, this is in that actual letter if you guys want to look it up. The first reason was that you agreed that there would be a joint investigation into the cell phone extraction investigation. But you're saying you need to drop the phone off at the office on August 14th at 9 a.m. That doesn't strike me as a joint investigation. That strikes me as, give us the phone, we'll go through it, and then we'll get back to you later. The second reason why it's impractical is because at the time, the Wells family was actually nowhere near Mississippi or nowhere near an area where they could actually drop it off and be compliant with that deadline. So those are 2 main reasons why. Now, again, you guys can read the letter yourself. But this now makes sense. This is why the family is so concerned, and this is why the family is so upset. Because the DA now is essentially going back on what they said, saying, we want you to drop off the phone on August 14th, when on July 15th, they said, we will do a joint investigation together. This is why the Wells family is so frustrated with this investigation. And this is why they're trying to get the Department of Justice involved. This is why all the leadership are getting involved in this, is because the family was under the expectation that the district attorney in Jackson County, Mississippi, was going to do a joint investigation based on the July 15th meeting. We just found out they may not want to do a joint investigation anymore. They're asking the Wells family to drop off the phone on August 14th at 9 a.m., which has already passed. But still, just drop off the phone. That's not the same as offering a joint investigation.
Before we get to what the internet thinks it may have found in a photograph, we need to focus on something far less dramatic, but potentially much more concrete. A phone. Because this is where the Nolan Wells case took another sharp turn this week during a live television discussion in front of a national audience. On a recent broadcast of Nancy Grace's Crime Stories, much of the discussion centered on one question that sounds almost too simple to become such an important part of an investigation. Where is Nolan Wells' phone, and why doesn't law enforcement have it yet? Here is what has been publicly discussed. Nolan's phone did not go home with him. According to multiple accounts, it ended up back with the group of young men who had been out on the water with him that day, and it eventually made its way to his mother, Christine. But what happened to that phone during the hours and days that followed is where the questions begin. Was anything deleted from it? Were any messages removed? Was the phone ever submitted for a complete forensic extraction? Those were some of the issues that created tension during the television discussion. Attorney Tyler Cox, who represents the young men who were on the boat, directly rejected claims involving missing texts or missing Snapchat messages. His position was that his clients had no reason to do anything with Nolan's phone other than return it. It was a straightforward denial. Then former Officer Brandon Tatum, who has personally interviewed several of the young men, raised a different point. According to Tatum, the family's attorney had only said they were prepared to cooperate as of a specific date weeks earlier. There is an important distinction there. Saying we are prepared to cooperate is not the same as saying we have already cooperated. Tatum described it as troubling that Nolan's mother, who is searching for answers about her son, would be questioned about why the phone had not been handed over sooner. A grieving mother was being asked on national television why she had not turned over her son's phone quickly enough, while the young men who were reportedly among the last people with Nolan were defended on the grounds that they had no reason to interfere with the device, creating the appearance of two different standards applied to two sides of the same tragedy. And the phone was not the only piece of property discussed. According to the same broadcast, the keys Nolan had with him that day also never made their way back to his family. They reportedly remained with the group. That raises another straightforward question. Once everyone realized something was wrong, why were Nolan's keys not immediately returned to his family? A phone can be complicated, involving passwords, cloud accounts, backups, and legal procedures. Keys are simple. That is exactly why their location has become another point of discussion. Then there is the audio recording. A recording from a call placed that night has already been publicly referenced in connection with the case, and could potentially help establish whether the timeline being discussed publicly lines up with what was actually said at the time. But as of the broadcast, there was no clear public explanation of what the recording contains, who has listened to the complete version, or why it has not been fully presented publicly or examined by investigators. And then we have the footage. The boat leaving the dock that morning was recorded, and versions have already circulated publicly, but footage showing that same boat returning to the dock has not surfaced publicly. That leads to an obvious question. If a camera was operating when the boat left, was it also operating when it returned? And if not, why? That does not automatically establish wrongdoing, since the missing recording can have many explanations, but in an investigation involving an unresolved timeline, it is still a question worth asking. And this is where the discussion moves away from television arguments and into digital forensics. Nancy Grace also brought in Heather Barnhart, a digital forensics expert with Cellebrite, a technology used by investigators to extract information from digital devices. What Barnhart explained is important because it focuses on how the technology actually works rather than what one side believes happened. Deleted information on a phone does not necessarily disappear forever. Depending on the device, operating system, and storage, certain files may remain recoverable for a period of time. The same applies to certain Snapchat messages, which may remain on Snapchat servers for a limited period if unopened, potentially giving investigators a window to obtain information through the appropriate legal process. In other words, pressing delete does not automatically mean a digital trail has vanished completely, which is why the phone remains such an important part of this story. As of the broadcast, the device still had not been fully examined by forensic investigators. That means questions remain about what information could potentially be recovered from it and what that information might reveal about Nolan's final hours. For Christine, that distinction is enormous. Somewhere out there is a device that could potentially provide additional information about her son's final communications, his activity, and the sequence of events leading up to his disappearance. And weeks into the investigation, those answers still had not been fully established. The issue is not necessarily that technology cannot provide answers. The issue is whether the people with the legal authority to obtain and examine the device have taken all the necessary steps to do so. So before we even get into any TikTok theory, Let's establish where the publicly discussed facts stood at the time of the broadcast. A grand jury was reportedly reviewing the case. The boat had not been searched with cadaver dogs. Nolan's keys had not been returned to his family. An audio recording connected to the timeline had not been publicly laid out in full. Footage showing the boat leaving the dock existed, but footage showing it returning had not surfaced publicly. And Nolan's phone, potentially one of the most important sources of digital information in the case, had still not undergone the forensic examination being discussed 6 weeks after he went out on the water and never returned home. A grand jury is not simply a formality. It is a legal process in which citizens review evidence presented by prosecutors and determine whether there is sufficient basis for formal charges. People outside that room do not know what conclusions, if any, it will ultimately reach, but its existence is still significant because it shows the case has moved beyond simply discussing what may have happened as an accident. Then there is the issue of the cadaver dogs. According to the discussion, the young men's side said they were willing to make the boat available for a cadaver dog search, and reportedly told civil rights attorney Benjamin Crump that he was welcome to bring cadaver dogs and search the Triton himself. Crump declined. When you look at the legal question rather than the headline, that decision has an explanation. A private attorney, regardless of how well known he may be, does not automatically have the legal authority to order a forensic search of someone else's property. That authority belongs to law enforcement acting within its jurisdiction. Defense attorney Philip DeBette made essentially that point during the broadcast. You cannot simply search someone else's property without the proper authority. So the boat remained unsearched, not necessarily because one side categorically refused to allow a search, but because the agency with the authority to conduct or order that type of investigation, the Jackson County Sheriff's Department, had not done so at that point. Then we come to one of the most important issues in the entire case, the autopsy. 2 medical examiners had reportedly weighed in, and as of the broadcast, neither had publicly established a definitive cause of death. One was reportedly still waiting for toxicology results. The other reportedly classified the death as undetermined, in part because there was not enough of the remains available for a complete examination after recovery. 6 weeks after Nolan went into the water, there was still no confirmed official cause of death publicly established. That naturally raises a question about how quickly drowning became the working theory and whether that assumption influenced how the investigation was handled during those critical first hours. There was also the issue of testing. Several of the young men reportedly participated in something described as a computer voice stress analysis rather than a traditional polygraph, a different technology with limitations that is not generally admissible as courtroom proof of truthfulness or deception. One of the young men, Warren, reportedly did not participate in even that type of testing. At the same time, the group's own phones, not Nolan's phone, were voluntarily provided to the FBI. So digital devices did move toward federal investigators in this case, just not the one device that remains at the center of so many unanswered questions. That is the part of the story that remains documented and unresolved. The phone, the keys, the audio recording, the missing return footage, the grand jury, the cadaver dog search that had not taken place, the unresolved cause of death, and the questions surrounding how the investigation was handled from the beginning. All of these issues existed before social media creators began analyzing individual frames of footage. And then, 2 days before this video, the situation took another significant turn. On August 13th, the Wells family's attorney reportedly received a letter from Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath's office. This was not described as a routine scheduling email. According to the information discussed, it was a formal letter giving the family 48 hours to physically deliver Nolan's phone to the district attorney's office by 9 a.m. on August 14th. Walk through that timeline carefully, because the dates are important. According to the family's attorney, there had already been an agreement on July 15th involving a joint investigation of Nolan's phone, with the FBI participating and both sides present during the extraction. That was reportedly the arrangement the family believed they had been operating under for weeks. Then, on August 12th at 12:51 in the afternoon, a letter was sent establishing a hard deadline less than 21 hours later, demanding that the phone be delivered to the district attorney's office by itself. The family's attorney responded within a day and explained why that demand was not workable, partly because the family was not even in the state when the letter arrived. But the larger issue was the difference between the original agreement and the new demand. Deliver the phone to our office by 9 a.m. is not the same thing as a joint forensic examination involving both sides and the FBI. One arrangement is collaborative. The other is a handoff, after which the device would be inside the district attorney's office and outside the direct control of the family and its representatives. It is a documented shift in the terms. An agreement described as a joint investigation in July, followed by a written deadline in August from the very office responsible for prosecuting cases in the jurisdiction. Why was the district attorney's office reportedly moving away from the earlier joint investigation arrangement? The paper trail described in the broadcast appears to show that this issue was developing in real time while Nolan's mother was still waiting for answers about what was actually contained on her son's phone. Was the 48-hour deadline simply an effort to secure potentially important evidence? Or did it represent a significant change from the agreement the family believed was already in place? Those are questions that should be answered through documents, evidence, and official statements, not assumptions. And now, this is where the story takes another turn. Before that letter had even become widely discussed, someone was already examining the actual boat footage from that day frame by frame. And according to that TikTok creator, she believes she noticed something that had not received much attention before, something that, if independently verified, could raise new questions about who was actually present on that boat that day.
All right, after this, I'm probably going to take a couple days off because my brain needs a rest after the last couple of days. Now we know for sure that there was storage in the bow of the boat.
Before we get into this next part, there is one thing that needs to be said plainly because it matters here more than almost anywhere else in this story. Everything in this section is a theory, not a finding and not a confirmed fact. It is a theory developed by one creator who has been examining publicly available photos and videos frame by frame. No forensic laboratory has verified her interpretation. No court has evaluated it. And no official finding has established that what she believes she sees actually happened. So we are going to show you exactly what she is claiming, explain how she reached that conclusion, and then separate what can actually be supported from what remains speculation. That distinction matters, especially in a case involving a real family, real people, and unanswered questions surrounding Nolan Wells. Her theory begins with a single photograph showing the Triton at the dock, reportedly earlier in the day as the group prepared to head toward Horn Island. According to the TikTok creator, something about that photograph does not look right. She directs attention to an area near the front of the boat, around a metal pole, which in her interpretation appears unusually smooth, a missing seam where a shadow might normally appear, and a reflection that seems inconsistent with the surrounding surfaces. From there she develops a bigger theory, that the photograph may have been edited, potentially with an AI-assisted tool, to remove something from the reflection, possibly a person standing close enough to the camera for their reflection to appear on that metal surface. This is exactly where we need to slow down. Digital image artifacts can happen for countless ordinary reasons. Compression, repeated saving, a phone's built-in processing, a screenshot of a screenshot. None of those automatically means someone deliberately edited an image. So is it possible the photograph was edited? But is a slightly smooth-looking section of pixels on a boat pole, by itself, proof that somebody removed a person from a photograph? That is not how forensic image analysis works, and no digital forensics expert has publicly examined this photograph and established that the area was deliberately manipulated. That is why the observation is worth mentioning but not treated as established fact. It can potentially be tested, but right now it remains an interpretation. The creator takes that interpretation even further, spending a significant portion of her video comparing different photographs from that day, attempting to determine who appears in each based on clothing, swim trunks, hats, and positioning. Eventually, she focuses on one figure who appears around the edges of multiple photographs, described as wearing a distinctive red and white striped swimsuit and a backward baseball cap, and develops a theory that this individual may have actually been on the Triton and was somehow removed from the original photograph. But again, that is her theory. There is no confirmed finding establishing that the photograph was altered or that a person was intentionally removed from it. The creator also goes further and attempts to identify the person based on clothing and the apparent relationships between people in later photographs. We are not going to present that guess as fact. If the identification is wrong, attaching a real person's name to a theory involving an ongoing death investigation can cause serious and unjustified harm. A photograph, a swimsuit, a hat, or the appearance of someone standing near another person is not enough to establish identity or involvement. That is a line worth maintaining. However, there is another detail in this story that is different because it does not come solely from the TikTok creator's interpretation. As discussed earlier in the case, there is a documented reference to an unidentified woman in the Jackson County Sheriff's Office report. According to the report, several friends who had been on the vessel with Nolan told deputies that he was last seen in the company of a woman investigators had not identified. That is not simply a social media theory. It is a detail attributed to an actual law enforcement report, and that creates a legitimate question. Several of the young men involved have publicly stated more than once that they were not on the same boat as Nolan that day. If that is their position, who exactly provided the account to deputies describing Nolan as being last seen with an unidentified woman? Somebody gave investigators that information, yet 6 weeks later there was still no publicly identified name attached to it. That does not tell us what happened, but it leaves an unanswered question in the timeline. And that brings us to another part of the TikTok creator's analysis, the Coast Guard call. This deserves particular attention because the wording matters. According to the creator's account of what Warren reportedly told Nolan's mother that first night, Warren said he knew someone in the Coast Guard and was going to call them. Now listen carefully. "I know someone in the Coast Guard and I'll call them" is not the same statement as "I called the Coast Guard." One refers to contacting a personal acquaintance. The other suggests an official emergency response had already begun. That distinction matters because the Coast Guard's initial public statement reportedly said they were not notified until around 12:30 that morning, a statement that was later changed. So what happened during that gap? Was an individual simply contacting a personal connection, or was an official emergency call actually made earlier? Those questions remained unresolved, and that is different from saying the TikTok theory is proven. Then the creator turns her attention to the boat's movements that night. Multiple stops, a detour back toward Fort Bayou instead of going directly to the dock, and a phone call reportedly muted partway through. She also highlights a moment where someone says, "We're untying now," while, in her interpretation, the phone call should still have been taking place. Some of those details naturally raise questions, but they also need context. A group of teenagers dealing with a disabled boat, unreliable cell service, multiple calls, confusion, and a developing emergency can produce a messy timeline without that meaning someone was trying to conceal something. Not every awkward pause is evidence of a cover-up. At the same time, if someone's account changes, investigators have a legitimate reason to ask why. And then there is Katie. This is another part of the story where the distinction between an unanswered question and an accusation becomes extremely important. According to the source material, accounts of Nolan's final hours on the island have repeatedly been filtered through what other people say Katie told them or what others believe happened between them. But Katie herself has not publicly spoken about those events. No public interview. No public statement. Nothing directly from her. There are, however, completely legitimate reasons someone might not speak publicly during a case like this. Attorneys routinely advise silence while an investigation is active, families want to protect people from intense attention, and a young person can quickly become the target of online speculation. Silence by itself does not establish guilt, knowledge, or involvement, so we are not accusing Katie of anything, and there is no basis for viewers to do so either. But the absence of her own public account does leave a gap in the publicly discussed timeline. If she was among the people who had direct knowledge of Nolan's final hours, her first-hand account could potentially clarify questions that have otherwise been reconstructed through second-hand statements. That does not mean she is obligated to speak publicly. It simply means that her direct account is not currently part of the public record. So where does this leave us? A photograph with an Area 1 TikTok creator believes may have been digitally altered, unverified. An unidentified woman referenced in an actual law enforcement report, with no confirmed identity attached. Questions about the timing of the Coast Guard contact, including an initial statement later changed. Questions about the boat's movements, phone calls, and a timeline interpreted differently by different people. And Katie, whose first-hand account has not been publicly heard. None of these details, individually or collectively, gives us permission to declare a conclusion the evidence does not establish. But unanswered questions are still questions, and the responsible thing to do is not turn everyone into an accusation, but keep asking what can actually be verified. The photograph can potentially be examined by qualified digital forensic experts. The unidentified woman reference can potentially be clarified through investigators or official records. The Coast Guard timeline can potentially be established through call records and official documentation. The boat's movements can potentially be compared against available location data, video, and communications. And the people who were directly involved can potentially provide investigators with first-hand accounts that can be tested against the evidence. That is how theories become either stronger or weaker, not through repetition on TikTok, and not because thousands of people online believe the same thing. The evidence has to carry the weight. So no, this case is not solved by a smoothed-over section of a photograph. It is not solved by identifying someone based on a swimsuit. It is not solved by assuming that every inconsistency represents deception. And it is certainly not solved by attaching an unverified theory to a real person's name. But the questions raised by this material are also not something that should simply be ignored. A photograph that appears unusual can be examined. A disputed timeline can be reconstructed. An unidentified witness can potentially be identified through legitimate investigative work. And gaps in the official record can be clarified. That is where this story stands. Not solved, not proven, but certainly not finished. And there is one more piece of this case that has not yet received the same level of attention in the public discussion. It does not come from a TikTok theory, a panel argument, or a frame-by-frame interpretation. And it may be the piece that helps explain why so many of these separate questions continue to lead back to the same few hours of Nolan Wells' final known timeline.
Here's something interesting that I didn't realize, did you? That first of all, the judge was on the island, according to Warren.
You could. If you want to sit there, if you're motivated enough to do it, yeah. Like, I made a phone call to my mom and I had to call her like 8 times before she picked up.
Everything discussed in this section is his interpretation of a detail, not an established finding. So, as we go through what he noticed, it is important to keep a clear line between what is actually contained in the clip and what he believes that information might mean. Before getting into the details, it is worth explaining why an unaccounted-for adult could matter in a case like this. On the surface, that might sound like a relatively small detail to build an entire segment around. But in a death investigation, seemingly minor details can become important when investigators are reconstructing a timeline. Investigators typically work to establish a timeline of last known movements. Who was where, who was with whom, and at what time. The goal is not to create suspicion around someone, but to narrow the possibilities and establish what actually happened, step by step, until there is as little room as possible for conflicting versions of events. Every adult who was genuinely present that day can therefore become a data point in that timeline. If someone is left out, the overall picture remains incomplete, which does not mean the missing person is responsible for anything. It simply means there is another piece of information investigators would ideally want to account for. He begins this portion of his video by returning to something relatively small, something that had already been said publicly weeks earlier but had largely passed without much attention. Warren, in one of his interviews, described why it took so long for him to reach his mother that night. According to his account, he tried calling her 8 times before she finally answered because the service was bad. He said she was on the back side of the island, on the south side. But his interpretation of that statement raises another question. If Warren's mother was on the island that day, then the list of people who were actually there, the list that people have been relying on for weeks, could potentially be missing at least one adult. Nobody is disputing that Warren said this. The question is something else entirely. Why has this detail apparently not appeared elsewhere, particularly in other interviews with people who were supposedly present? That is where another statement from Warren, made during a different part of the same series of interviews, becomes relevant, because the two descriptions do not fit together perfectly. In one account, Warren described the cell service on Horn Island as basically fine, and said he called his mother while out there and the call was fine. In another account, that same call is described very differently. Suddenly there were 8 attempts to get through, with poor service supposedly making it difficult. Those are 2 different descriptions of what appears to be the same call, from the same person, and they do not completely match. There may be a simple explanation. Different moments and locations on the water can produce different coverage. That possibility should not be ignored. At the same time, an inconsistency like this is exactly the kind of thing investigators would normally want clarified rather than dismissed. From there, he connects the phone call issue to another detail, a reference in what he describes as a 911 call involving a group that was allegedly heading toward the judge's house that night. And this is where he asks a very direct question. Why would a 911 call reference a house that was not the address of the missing person, was not the address of the boat, and was not an address that has otherwise been clearly explained? More specifically, why the judge's house? And who exactly is the judge in this story? The call being referenced may not necessarily be the same 911 call that people think it is. Separately, in the boy's own account of that night, Wyatt is described as the person who called 911, not because Nolan was missing but because a group tracking a phone's location appeared to be heading toward Wyatt's own house, and he wanted police there before they arrived. That is a documented call as described by more than one of the boys. So, is that the same 911 reference being discussed when he mentions the judge's house, remembered or mislabeled differently, or was there another, separate call not yet publicly accounted for? At this point, we genuinely do not know, and neither does he. But the question is not meaningless. It could potentially be answered quickly if the relevant dispatch records were made available. The third detail he focuses on is a text message that he says was sent to Christine from that same person. The message reportedly reads roughly, "If and when you ever want to talk, here's my number." He focuses heavily on the wording, particularly the word if. Not when you're ready. Not whenever you want. But if, which could imply that there may never be a conversation. From his perspective, that wording does not sound like the way someone close to the family, particularly someone who might possess relevant information, would normally reach out to a mother during one of the worst periods of her life. There is another interpretation that deserves equal consideration. Grief, guilt, or simple awkwardness can make people say strange things. Sometimes people genuinely do not know what to say to a mother who has just lost her son, so they choose careful language because they do not want to intrude or pressure someone who is grieving. If and when could simply be someone giving Christine space to decide whether she ever wants to speak. It could also represent someone intentionally keeping their distance. Both interpretations are possible from the same 4 words, which is exactly why a single text message should not be treated as the thing that solves or breaks open a case. To his credit, he is careful about how he presents all 3 of these points. He says it himself on camera, he is just asking questions. He is not accusing anyone or claiming that these details prove anything. That is the correct instinct, even if the internet does not always follow that same standard. But it is also worth acknowledging that the phrase, "I'm just asking questions," can serve 2 purposes: genuine caution that brings attention to something without exaggerating what it proves, or, particularly in true crime content, a way of placing an accusation into the public conversation while maintaining enough distance to say none was technically made. We are not going to tell you which this is. What matters is maintaining the distinction between a question and a conclusion, a responsibility that belongs to the person making the video as much as to everyone watching and discussing the case. An adult being somewhere on an island where teenagers were gathered is not, by itself, evidence of wrongdoing. A 911 call referencing a particular house does not automatically mean that house was a crime scene. And one carefully worded text message is certainly not proof of guilt. 3 unusual details taken together can justify a question. They do not justify a verdict, and we are not going to give you one that the available evidence does not support. What these details do justify is something much simpler: a request for clarification, a name, a timeline, and an explanation that can be independently checked. Right now, those pieces do not appear to be publicly established. If there really was an adult on that island who has not been accounted for anywhere in 6 weeks of interviews, then that is a gap in the publicly described timeline, regardless of who that person ultimately turns out to be. And gaps in an investigation should be filled with facts, not with guesses from a comment section. Ask people following this case who that unnamed adult actually is, and you will hear confident answers that contradict one another. Some claim it was Nolan's mother, others a stepmother, others completely different names. Every one of those answers is, at this point, a guess, and none has been confirmed. 6 weeks of silence from the people who could potentially answer a simple question creates a vacuum, and the person who fills it first is not necessarily the person who is correct. The frustrating part is that this particular gap may actually be easier to resolve than many of the case's other unanswered questions. This is not necessarily a forensic extraction requiring weeks of technical work and a court order. Dispatch records could potentially show what address was referenced during a 911 call and when it came in. Phone records could establish who called whom and where the phones were connecting from, compared against available location information. None of that requires anyone to hand over a password or unlock a device for the world to see. It simply requires investigators to follow the thread and determine whether it leads somewhere meaningful. For 6 weeks, several pieces of this story have remained unresolved, and while people online continue to analyze interviews, photographs, messages, and recollections, the family is still left waiting for answers. At the center of that is Christine, who did not ask for strangers to perform frame-by-frame analysis of old photographs, or for a private text message she received during an unimaginably difficult period to become something thousands of strangers would dissect online. From the beginning, the question she was asking was much simpler. Where is my son? 6 weeks later, that question is still buried underneath a grand jury investigation, a DA's ultimatum letter, a disputed photograph, and another question about an adult allegedly present on the island. But underneath it all, the central issue remains the same. Where is the answer? Everything else in this story exists because that fundamental question has not yet been resolved. So, 3 parts into this story, where does that leave us? A phone still reportedly not in investigators' hands. A DA's office that agreed to a joint investigation in July and later sent a 48-hour ultimatum in August. A photograph with a smoothed-over area nobody has publicly established as proof of anything. An unnamed woman referenced in an actual sheriff's report. And now an adult who, according to Warren's own account, was present on the island but has not been publicly identified or explained. None of that gives us permission to manufacture certainty. It gives us a series of unanswered questions that should be answered through evidence, documentation, interviews, records, and a properly conducted investigation, not speculation. Every thread does not lead to a crime. Every inconsistency does not mean someone is lying. But unanswered questions are still worth asking, particularly when the answers could be established through records that already exist. Ultimately, every one of these threads points toward the same 2 realities. A family that still does not have the answers it deserves, and an investigation that has had weeks to close some of these gaps but has not yet done so publicly. Until that changes, the responsible approach is to keep examining the information that can actually be verified. Follow the evidence. Check the records. Separate what is known from what is alleged. And leave the guesses where they belong. Because in a case like this, the difference between an unanswered question and an accusation is enormous. We will keep pulling on the threads that are actually there, while leaving alone the ones that are nothing more than guesses wearing the appearance of a headline.
On the boat that day. Officer Tatum, thank you for being with us. Let me talk about this one moment. We've got so much to get to. I'm going to try to be brief. Tyler Cox stating, I don't think they cooperated at all. I think he's talking about Nolan's family. They, I guess, the sheriff's office, haven't had access to Nolan's phone. Well, can't they subpoena that? It's called a subpoena ducis tecum. You're familiar with those. You've testified in court. A subpoena ducis tecum is, we hear about subpoenas for testimony. I've been subpoenaed. Yes, go to court and tell the truth. A subpoena ducis tecum is for an item, an object, a document. The sheriff can give out a subpoena ducis tecum or get a warrant for an object. So, you don't have it? Fine. Get it. Next, So how can you say I'm quoting, how can you say there's no text message or photo, as a text message or photos missing? Our boys had no reason to do anything with Nolan's phone other than give it back. So seeing anything about missing texts or Snapchats completely false. Well, according to the mom, Officer Tatum, she says that there was nothing sent out while Nolan, was at Horn Island, which she found very odd. I have no reason to disbelieve her. So how can you say there were missing or there weren't missing? I don't think you can say it either way. Why don't they just get a search warrant and go get the phone? You know what? Forget all that. Officer Tatum, where is Nolan's phone? Do authorities have it?
Well, from my understanding, authorities do not have it, and the family have not been cooperating with authorities to give the phone over. According to the testimony or written statement from the lawyer that represents the family, the Nolan Wells family, he had made mention that he's prepared to cooperate, but they have not cooperated yet, which is very interesting to me. You want to find out what happened to your son. You would think you will be doing everything you can to cooperate. I can't judge her. I don't know what's in their mind, but it just seems to be very off-putting for them not to at least give the phone over and do what exactly they told the world they were going to do, and that is to allow a forensic extraction of his phone. Therefore, the world can see if there is things that have been deleted. I think Tyler Cox is very clear about what he's saying, that the boys had nothing to do with it. So if there is anything missing from the phone, it had nothing to do with them. Now, I'll add this. When you look at what Christine said.
Brandon, whoa, bit. I'm going to go right back to what you're saying, but you're saying a lot, and I want to address each thing so we don't leave anything out. Number one, you just stated that, basically. Correct me, you can paraphrase this any way you want to. It looks really bad for Nolan's family not to hand over the phone. Do you have any independent knowledge they have not handed over the phone?
According to their lawyer that wrote a statement, and the statement was, we're prepared to cooperate, but that was as of the 11th. Therefore, they have not cooperated. Tyler Cox has made mention that he don't believe they cooperated whatsoever. He don't believe they cooperated whatsoever as well. So
extrapolating. You're taking the words, Tatum, that their words that they're prepared to cooperate to mean they haven't handed over the phone. Isn't that true?
I'm putting everything together, right? We have Tyler Cox that's coming out and saying that he has no indication whatsoever they've cooperated. The family has not come out and said that there's any findings. And then also the attorney that represents the family is saying that we haven't sent or gave the phone over, but we're willing to. And that was as of the 11th.
No,
so it appears that there's no indication that.
Brandon, you may very well be a lot smarter than me, but I can hear. Okay. The statement was, we're prepared to cooperate, I guess from Crump. That does
I'm not
not
sure
mean
if it was.
We have not handed over the phone, but we will.
Well, Nancy, when you put it all, you have to put the totality of circumstance together. I'm not there to be in the room with the investigators to determine, but I'm just going off of what knowledge we have and that's been given to us that's available. And what Tyler Cox is saying, and I'm taking him at his word, he's saying that there's no indication that they've cooperated. The lawyers that represent the family is saying we're prepared, but they did not say that they've cooperated whatsoever. So I'm looking at the statements that are produced, and all of the statements indicate that there has not been a cooperation with the phone being extracted from investigators. Therefore, there is no true determination that things were missing from the phone. Well, I mean, we have no other. We have no other. We have nothing else to go off of.
We're prepared to cooperate. For all I know, that means we'll come in for questioning. We'll let you search his belongings. It
Nancy,
can mean anything. That does not equal we have not handed over the phone. But hey, you know what?
Nancy, it's been weeks.
You say tomato, I say tomato, because it kind of doesn't matter, and I'll tell you why it doesn't matter. Actually, I'll let an expert tell us why it doesn't matter. To Heather Barnhart joining us, digital forensics expert with Celebrite. We learned all about Celebrite during the Alex Murdaugh trial. That's how we got everything off of his dead, murdered son's phone. And the SANS Institute, SANS. She is one of the preeminent digital forensic experts in the country. She helped crack the Brian Kohberger case, and she is co-author of Practical Mobile Forensics, now in its 4th edition. That means that many people have used it. Heather, thank you for being with us. If the phone,
Thank you for having me.
I don't care where it is. Okay, actually, I do care where it is. I want to know that it's been handed over. I don't have to have the phone to know what's on the phone if it's in the cloud. It looks like an iPhone to me. So my argument with Officer Tatum is academic. It doesn't matter if I can get it from the cloud. So Nolan's phone missing. So what? I can download it. I can get it.
Data will exist in the cloud if he's syncing to iCloud and third-party applications. However, having physical access to the phone is where the databases exist that will have the truth on deletion. So you really need to get a full file system extraction of his phone as quickly as possible. So if it's not handed over to authorities now, it needs to be, because this was over a month ago now.
Do you have to have the phone to do the extraction? What about the cloud?
Cloud data is different, and there's a lot of information there. There could be unique information in the cloud that's been removed from the phone, if anything was removed, but it's best to have both cloud and the phone to paint the entire pattern of behavior and to see the truth.
We've spent 3 parts examining what people are claiming, what they believe happened, and which details have raised questions. But this part is different. This section is about something much more important: how any of these theories can actually be proven or disproven. Because underneath every theory we've discussed tonight, there is a real, often unglamorous investigative process that either happens or doesn't. Evidence has to be collected. Records have to be examined. Devices have to be analyzed. Searches have to be properly authorized. Medical findings have to be completed and documented. So, instead of focusing on speculation, let's walk through the process step by step, the way an investigator would actually approach it. Let's start with digital forensics. When Nancy Grace brought in Heather Barnhart, she wasn't simply bringing another commentator onto the program. Barnhart has professional experience in digital forensics and works with Cellebrite, the extraction technology used in major criminal investigations, and has co-authored a standard reference text in the field. That background matters because someone with that level of technical experience explaining how phone forensics actually works is not the same as opinion or speculation. Here's the basic principle. A modern phone can synchronize enormous amounts of information with cloud services, storing photos, messages, application activity, and backups remotely as long as it is connected to services such as iCloud. If law enforcement has the appropriate legal authority, they can sometimes obtain that information directly from the cloud provider without ever physically possessing the phone. That is real and useful, but it is not the entire picture. The physical phone can contain information a cloud account does not necessarily preserve the same way. The device itself contains internal databases and system records that can show what existed on the phone, how it was used, and in some circumstances what was later deleted. The question is not simply what information was on the phone, but whether something was deleted, when, and what the device can tell investigators about that activity. For that, having the physical device can be extremely valuable. Cloud data and device data can provide different pieces of the same story, and one does not automatically make the other unnecessary. That's why the argument that the cloud already has the information, so investigators don't need the phone, doesn't completely hold up. The cloud may not contain the same device-level history, and those differences can matter. Now, that brings us to the missing phone itself. Why isn't a missing phone automatically suspicious, and at the same time, why isn't it automatically meaningless? One of the sharper exchanges in this case centered on a simple premise. Teenagers generally don't separate from their phones. Officer Tatum raised that point, and Nancy Grace pushed back, describing how when she went swimming with her children, her phone stayed on the boat and she made sure it came back with her. Both perspectives can be reasonable. Phones get left behind on boats for ordinary reasons. A dead battery, a grabbed wrong bag, a split-up group, simple forgetfulness. According to the boy's account, Nolan was reportedly not the only person who left a phone behind that day. That is an ordinary explanation and deserves to be considered, But an ordinary explanation for why the phone was left is not the same as saying there is nothing left to investigate. The reasonable position is somewhere in the middle. Leaving a phone on a boat is not unusual. But a phone remaining with another family for weeks without being turned over to the agency that could perform a forensic extraction is a different issue. The important question isn't, why was the phone left on the boat, but why has the phone still not been forensically examined weeks later? That is what forensic testing is supposed to do, replace speculation with evidence. Now let's move to another issue that has generated a significant amount of confusion: how a search of the boat would actually have to be authorized. According to the broadcast, cadaver dogs were made available to attorney Benjamin Crump by people connected to the young men's side, with an offer to bring the dogs out and search the Triton. Crump did not accept that offer. At first glance, that might seem confusing, but the answer becomes clearer once the legal authority to conduct such a search is considered. Defense attorney Philip DeBette explained that a private citizen, even a nationally known civil rights attorney representing a grieving family, cannot simply authorize a search of somebody else's property. Only the law enforcement agency with jurisdiction, in this case the Jackson County Sheriff's Department, can conduct a search in a way that is properly integrated into an official investigation and potentially preserved as evidence. So here's the detective-level version. An offer was made, it was not accepted because accepting it would not necessarily have made the search legally meaningful, and law enforcement reportedly did not conduct the search themselves. That isn't necessarily a gotcha against either side. It is better understood as a procedural gap that remains important because the question has not simply disappeared. The next issue is even more significant: how a medical examiner actually determines drowning, and why the word drowning does not automatically mean accident. Forensic pathologist Joe Scott Morgan, who has conducted thousands of death investigations, explained that drowning does not necessarily tell the entire story of how a person died. Someone could suffer a head injury, lose consciousness, fall into the water, and ultimately drown. Drowning could still be the mechanism of death without explaining why the person ended up in the water in the first place. The medical examiner's job is not simply to identify water in the lungs and stop there. Investigators examine a combination of physical evidence, including the lungs, the inner ear, and the brain, to reconstruct what happened. There isn't one single test that answers every question. Medical conclusions are often based on a pattern built from multiple pieces of evidence, and that takes time to do carefully. We've spent 3 parts examining what people are claiming, what they believe happened, and which details have raised questions. But this part is different. This section is about something much more important: how any of these theories can actually be proven or disproven. Because underneath every theory we've discussed tonight, there is a real, often unglamorous investigative process that either happens or doesn't. Evidence has to be collected. Records have to be examined. Devices have to be analyzed. Searches have to be properly authorized. Medical findings have to be completed and documented. So, instead of focusing on speculation, let's walk through the process step by step, the way an investigator would actually approach it. Let's start with digital forensics. When Nancy Grace brought in Heather Barnhart, she wasn't simply bringing another commentator onto the program. Barnhart has professional experience in digital forensics and works with Cellebrite, the extraction technology used in major criminal investigations, and has co-authored a standard reference text in the field. That background matters because someone with that level of technical experience explaining how phone forensics actually works is not the same as opinion or speculation. Here's the basic principle. A modern phone can synchronize enormous amounts of information with cloud services, storing photos, messages, application activity, and backups remotely as long as it is connected to services such as iCloud. If law enforcement has the appropriate legal authority, they can sometimes obtain that information directly from the cloud provider without ever physically possessing the phone. That is real and useful, but it is not the entire picture. The physical phone can contain information a cloud account does not necessarily preserve the same way. The device itself contains internal databases and system records that can show what existed on the phone, how it was used, and in some circumstances what was later deleted. The question is not simply what information was on the phone, but whether something was deleted, when, and what the device can tell investigators about that activity. For that, having the physical device can be extremely valuable. Cloud data and device data can provide different pieces of the same story, and one does not automatically make the other unnecessary. That's why the argument that the cloud already has the information, so investigators don't need the phone, doesn't completely hold up. The cloud may not contain the same device-level history, and those differences can matter. Now, that brings us to the missing phone itself. Why isn't a missing phone automatically suspicious, and at the same time, why isn't it automatically meaningless? One of the sharper exchanges in this case centered on a simple premise. Teenagers generally don't separate from their phones. Officer Tatum raised that point, and Nancy Grace pushed back, describing how when she went swimming with her children, her phone stayed on the boat and she made sure it came back with her. Both perspectives can be reasonable. Phones get left behind on boats for ordinary reasons. A dead battery, a grabbed wrong bag, a split-up group, simple forgetfulness. According to the boy's account, Nolan was reportedly not the only person who left a phone behind that day. That is an ordinary explanation and deserves to be considered, but an ordinary explanation for why the phone was left is not the same as saying there is nothing left to investigate. The reasonable position is somewhere in the middle. Leaving a phone on a boat is not unusual. But a phone remaining with another family for weeks without being turned over to the agency that could perform a forensic extraction is a different issue. The important question isn't, why was the phone left on the boat, but why has the phone still not been forensically examined weeks later? That is what forensic testing is supposed to do, replace speculation with evidence. Now let's move to another issue that has generated a significant amount of confusion, how a search of the boat would actually have to be authorized. According to the broadcast, cadaver dogs were made available to attorney Benjamin Crump by people connected to the young men's side, with an offer to bring the dogs out and search the Triton. Crump did not accept that offer. At first glance that might seem confusing, but the answer becomes clearer once the legal authority to conduct such a search is considered. Defense attorney Philip DeBette explained that a private citizen, even a nationally known civil rights attorney representing a grieving family, cannot simply authorize a search of somebody else's property. Only the law enforcement agency with jurisdiction, in this case the Jackson County Sheriff's Department, can conduct a search in a way that is properly integrated into an official investigation and potentially preserved as evidence. So here's the detective-level version. An offer was made, it was not accepted because accepting it would not necessarily have made the search legally meaningful, and law enforcement reportedly did not conduct the search themselves. That isn't necessarily a gotcha against either side. It is better understood as a procedural gap that remains important because the question has not simply disappeared. The next issue is even more significant: how a medical examiner actually determines drowning, and why the word drowning does not automatically mean accident. Forensic pathologist Joe Scott Morgan, who has conducted thousands of death investigations, explained that drowning does not necessarily tell the entire story of how a person died. Someone could suffer a head injury, lose consciousness, fall into the water, and ultimately drown. Drowning could still be the mechanism of death without explaining why the person ended up in the water in the first place. The medical examiner's job is not simply to identify water in the lungs and stop there. Investigators examine a combination of physical evidence, including the lungs, the inner ear, and the brain, to reconstruct what happened. There isn't one single test that answers every question. Medical conclusions are often based on a pattern built from multiple pieces of evidence, and that takes time to do carefully.